History is a ledger of accounted for events. But what of the accounts that were never balanced? The stories that were written in the margins, in letters that were burned, in the private journals of country doctors who witnessed things their science could not classify? What if, in a forgotten corner of America, an entire town became a case study in a transformation so profound it was erased from the record for fear of what it implied?
Where are you all watching this video from? Let me know in the comments so I can see how far my video is reaching and who's watching it. Don't forget to drop your location below.
This is the story of Willowfen. The year is 1879, and this is not a ghost story. It is an investigation into a documented incident of irreversible change that challenges our understanding of biology, faith, and the very geometry of our world. The question I am left with, after piecing together the fragments, is not what happened, but whether it ever truly stopped. Our story begins where most rural histories do, with the land. Willowfen was a town carved from the stubborn soil of western Massachusetts, a pocket of isolation where the Berkshire Hills begin to soften. It was bordered on one side by forests so dense they seemed to swallow the light, and on the other by the sluggish, iron-rich waters of the Ashwelot River. The air here was always heavy, carrying a peculiar sweetness beneath the metallic temps of the water ascent like bruised apples in a damp cellar, a detail noted by the few travelers who passed through. The townspeople, numbering no more than 200 souls, were accustomed to it. They called it the fen breath, a harmless artifact of their geography. At the heart of Willowfen stood the Harlan family. Elias Harlan was the town miller, a man whose character was as solid and dependable as the stones he used to grind corn. His wife, Abigail, was the town's unofficial herbalist, her garden a carefully tended library of remedies for fevers, agues, and the general weariness of a life lived by the seasons. They had 2 children, Thomas, 12, a quiet, observant boy with his father's hands, and Clara, a wisp of a girl, at 6, whose solemn gaze seemed to hold a wisdom beyond her years. The Harlans were the bedrock of Willowfen Pious, and unremarkable in the best possible way. They were the last family you would expect to become an entry in a ledger of the unexplained. The first hint of wrongness came not with a bang, but with a whisper from the river. In the late summer of 1879, Reverend Josiah Hale, a man of meticulous habits, noted in his parish ledger a document I was fortunate enough to access in a dusty county archive an entry that at the time must have seemed trivial. September 14th, Elias Harlan reports an oddity at the mill. The wheel turns heavy, as if the water has thickened. He notes a change in the taste from the well still sweet, but with a more pronounced iron aftertaste, like a new coin. A week later, another entry, September 21st. Abigail Harlan complains of a persistent pressure behind the eyes, a sensation of altitude sickness, though she has not left the lowlands. The child, Clara, seems unaffected, though her usual play has taken on a peculiar orderliness. She arranges pebbles from the riverbank in intricate, spiraling patterns. This is where our investigation must diverge from simple history and enter the realm of medical realism. I found the private log of a Dr. Elias Whitaker, a physician from the neighboring town of Northfield, who was called to Willowfen to examine. Abigail Whitaker was a man of the new science, a believer in germ theory and a skeptic of rural superstitions. His notes are clinical, precise, and increasingly disturbed. October 2nd, examined Mrs. Harlan. No signs of fever or infection. Pulse steady, describes a cranial pressure. Pupils are reactive. Tested the well water. Elevated iron content, consistent with the region, but also an unidentifiable organic compound that refracts light in a peculiar manner. Advised she, avoid the water and prescribed a bromide tonic for the nerves. Nerves. That was the heiress explanation for anything the body felt that the eye could not see. But the anomalies were not confined to the Harlan's sensations. They began to manifest in the physical world in ways that strained logic. Elias found his tools at the mill arranged in perfect geometric formations, each morning saws and hammers, aligned at precise right angles, as if laid out by a draftsman. Abigail's garden began to grow in ways that defied her planting. rows of rosemary twisted into helical patterns. Patches of thyme formed interlocking hexagonal shapes. The changes were subtle, beautiful even, but they were not her work. The buildup of suspense was not in any single event, but in the accumulation of quiet impossibilities. The family's transformation began not in the body, but in their perception of the world. Elias started having dreams not of monsters, but of mathematics. He described waking with the phantom sensation of having spent the night walking through corridors of light, their walls shifting in complex, non-Euclidean geometry. He would rise and find himself tracing these impossible angles in the flour dust on the mill floor. Abigail found her vision sharpening to a painful degree. She could perceive the minute crystalline structures in a pane of glass, the subtle bending of light at the edge of a water basin. The world, once a place of soft, organic shapes, was resolving into a terrifyingly precise architecture of lines and angles. Reverend Hale, caught between the language of faith and the evidence of his senses, struggled to interpret the signs. His sermons began to touch on themes of divine geometry, the sacred proportions of Solomon's temple, the mathematical order of the heavens. He was trying to fit the Harlan's experience into a framework of religious ecstasy, a divine encounter, but his private journal tells a different story. October 28th, the Harlan child, Clara her eyes. They hold a light that is not reflected. It seems to come from within, a suppressed glow, like moonlight seen through deep water. Her movements are no longer a child's. They are coordinated, impossibly smooth, as if she is moving along an invisible grid. Today, I watched her place a fallen leaf on the ground, and for a moment, the frost on the grass receded from it in a perfect circle. This is not the geometry of God. It is something else. Here, the theme of irreversible transformation takes root. The Harlans were not merely witnessing strange events. They were becoming part of them. The most terrifying changes were happening to the children. Thomas, who had always been a grounded, practical boy, began to exhibit impossible biological traits. He could bend his fingers back to his wrists without pain. He could lock his joints at perfect 90-degree angles, holding poses for minutes at a time with an eerie stillness. Dr. Whitaker returned, his professional curiosity now tinged with a palpable dread. His notes from this visit are the most detailed and the most unnerving. November 11th. The boy, Thomas, demonstrates extreme hypermobility of the joints, a condition with no precedent in my experience. The flexibility is not laxity. It is controlled, precise. He can form his limbs into shapes that seem to follow a geometric logic. I watched him interlock his fingers into a configuration that should be anatomically impossible, yet it held firm, a living knot of flesh and bone. Clara's ocular luminosity has increased. The glow is subtle, a phosphorescence that seems to coordinate with her brother's movements. When he forms an angle with his arm, a corresponding line of light flickers deep within her irises. They are connected by a principle I cannot name. This blend of science and existential dread is the crux of the Willowfen case. Whitaker, a man of medicine, was confronted with biological traits that were not a product of disease, but of design. A design that was intelligent, mathematical, and utterly alien. The horror was not in gore or violence, but in this quiet, elegant overriding of the human form. The family was being remade, their very biology realigned to a new and terrifying set of rules. As winter approached, the fog that rose from the river grew thicker, more persistent. It was within this fog that the townspeople began to see them moments of suppressed horror that would haunt their collective memory for years. A farmer, returning late, saw glowing eyes in the mist at the edge of the Harlan property, not the bright, feral glare of an animal, but 2 points of soft, coordinated light that moved with impossible smoothness, tracking his approach. Another saw Thomas walking by the river, his steps not leaving prints in the soft mud, as if his feet no longer needed to make contact with the ground. These were glimpses, ambiguities, a thriller unfolding in the periphery of vision. The Harlans became isolated, a family adrift in a sea of their own strangeness. They were not sick, they were not mad. They were transforming. And as the first snows began to fall, dusting the town in a blanket of white, they were approaching the night that would cement their story in the annals of the unexpected. Night when the geometry that had been whispering at the edges of their lives would finally reveal its full, terrifying form. Winter in Willowfen was always a time of enclosure, of families drawing inward against the cold. But in the winter of 1879, the enclosure felt different. It was not the comfort of a hearth, but the airless tension of a sealed room. The phenomena were no longer confined to the Harlan household. They began to seep into the town itself, as if the land were learning a new and unsettling language. The parish ledger, our most consistent record, documents the spread. Reverend Hale writes of parishioners experiencing aligned dreams, waking with the distinct memory of their limbs being moved into precise, angular positions while they slept. A carpenter reported that his tools, plummet, square, and rule would be found arranged in complex, star-like patterns on his workbench each morning. The snow in the town green, undisturbed by footfalls, would sometimes melt in lines and arcs, forming geometric shapes that mirrored Thomas Harlan's increasingly elaborate sketches. Science, in the form of Dr. Whitaker, was becoming less an instrument of diagnosis and more a chronicle of disbelief. His log entries from this period are a testament to a man realizing the limits of his worldview. December 3rd. Clara Harlan's condition has progressed. The phosphorescence in her eyes is now visible even in moderate daylight. It is not merely a glow, it is structured. I observed, with the aid of a magnifying lens, what appeared to be living, luminous filaments within the iris, forming a crystalline lattice. They shift and realign, their geometry coordinating with her focus. When she looks at the corner of a room, the filaments form a perfect right angle. This is not a biological anomaly. This is architecture. Architecture. The word is chilling in its implication. The transformations were not random mutations. They were following a blueprint. This is the core of the existential dread that permeates the Willowfen case. The Harlans were not just changing. They were being meticulously redesigned. The theme of irreversible transformation was most terrifyingly expressed in Abigail. Her heightened perception of angles had evolved into a constant, agonizing state. She described to Hale because she had long since abandoned hope in medicine, that she could no longer see the world in curves. The gentle slope of a hill appeared as a series of sharp, intersecting planes. A human face was a collection of jarring triangles and trapezoids. Her mind, once a repository of herbal lore and gentle faith, was being forcibly rewired to perceive reality as a purely geometric construct. Her journal entries, scraps of which were preserved by Hale, are almost impossible to read. The lines are everywhere. The world is a cage of them. God's grace was in the softness, the give of things. This new seeing, it has no mercy. It is only correct. The child's eyes hold the map. We are the territory being redrawn. We see here a mind collapsing under the weight of a new, unbearable truth. The horror is not external, but internal. It is a psychological toll of having your very perception of reality stripped away and replaced with something alien. The moments of suppressed horror became more frequent, more unsettling. The family's coordination achieved a supernatural synchrony. Elias and Thomas, working at the mill, would move in perfect, mirrored motion, lifting sacks and adjusting machinery without a word, their limbs forming a single, complex machine. A neighbor, watching from a distance, described it as a horrible grace, like puppets dancing on strings made of light. The thrill of this new existence was, perhaps, most evident in the children. They were not afraid. Clara would spend hours in the snow, her small hands, now capable of impossible articulations, shaping the snow into crystalline structures that would not melt even in the midday sun. Thomas began to speak of what he called the inner map, a sense of the world's true, geometric form that he could now perceive. He told his father that the river did not flow. It followed a prescribed, angular path. He claimed the trees did not grow. They extruded themselves along lines of force. He was not a boy descending into madness. He was a boy becoming a scholar of a new, terrifying physics. This blend of science and religion reached its breaking point. Reverend Hale, witnessing the family's transformation, began to preach sermons that bordered on heresy. He spoke of God not as a loving father, but as a divine mathematician, an architect of realities, whose designs were cold, perfect, and indifferent to human suffering. He posited that perhaps humanity was not a final creation, but a raw material, waiting to be reshaped. We are told the temple was built to divine measure, but what if the measure is not for stone, but for flesh? What if the straight line and the right angle are the tools of a new creation, and we are the wood to be hewn, the stone to be broken and reset? The congregation dwindled. The people of Willowfen could abide a mystery, but they could not abide a faith that offered no comfort, only a more profound dread. Dr. Whitaker made one final visit. He brought with him a new instrument, a primitive form of spectroscope, hoping to analyze the light from Clara's eyes. His log entry from that day is his last. It is brief, clinical, and reads like the surrender of a man of science. December 21st. The light from the child's eyes is not of any known spectrum. It contains patterns. It is not reflected light. It is information. The family no longer perceives me as a physician, but as a shape, an intrusion of organic chaos into their world of perfect order. Their transformation is, in my medical opinion, complete and irreversible. I can do no more here. May God, or whatever architect governs this place, have mercy on them, and on us. Whitaker left Willowfen the next morning and, according to county records, never practiced medicine again. He had realized the truth that lay at the heart of the case. This was not an illness to be cured. It was an evolution, or an invasion. On a biological and spiritual level, as the year drew to its close, the town held its breath. The Harlans rarely left their home now, but their presence was felt everywhere. The geometric patterns appeared in the frost on every window. The low, resonant hum from the river seemed to pulse with a mathematical rhythm. The townspeople were no longer just witnesses. They were living inside the experiment. And the night of December 24th, Christmas Eve of 1879, was the night the experiment would reach its conclusion, the night the geometry would demand its final, perfect form. There are nights in history that feel preordained, as if the calendar itself has been leading to a single, inevitable point. Christmas Eve, 1879, in Willowfen was such a night. The air grew unnaturally still, the usual winter winds falling silent. A heavy, expectant pressure settled over the town, the kind of pressure that precedes a storm, but the sky was clear, filled with stars that seemed to glitter with a cold, geometric intensity. The fen breath, the sweet, metallic scent of the valley, intensified, clinging to the air like a shroud inside their homes. The people of Willowfen felt it. They described it later as a vibrational dread, a low thrum that resonated not in the ears, but in the bones, in the teeth. Reverend Hale, alone in his study, wrote in his ledger, his hand shaking so badly the words are barely legible. The pressure returns. It is not a force from without, but a resonance from within. The very timbers of this house are tuning themselves. I feel my own thoughts aligning, forming patterns I do not recognize as my own. The Lord's Prayer feels inadequate. The geometry is coming to a point. The theme of irreversible transformation was no longer a slow creep. It was an imminent, terrifying reality. The town itself was being prepared for a final alignment. The most disturbing reports from that night came from those who dared to look towards the Harlan property. They saw the house not as a structure of wood and nails, but as a nexus of light and shadow. The windows did not emit a warm, lamplit glow. They pulsed with a soft, internal luminescence, the same structured light that shone from Clara's eyes, now magnified to an architectural scale. The suppressed horror of the preceding months gave way to moments of overt, terrifying spectacle. The snow in the field between the church and the Harlan mill began to move, not melting, not drifting, but rearranging itself. Lines etched themselves across the pristine white surface, forming a vast, complex diagram of fractal pattern of intersecting triangles and hexagons that seemed to grow outward from the Harlan house. It was a living blueprint drawn by an unseen hand on a canvas of snow and moonlight. My role in piecing this together has shifted from that of a historian to something more akin to a forensic psychologist trying to reconstruct the thought process of a force that does not think as we do. The patterns in the snow were not random. They mirrored diagrams found in esoteric texts on sacred geometry, in the notebooks of Renaissance architects who believed they had glimpsed the mathematical mind of God. But this was different. This was not a depiction of order. This was the imposition of it. Inside the Harlan house, the final transformation was occurring. We have no direct witness, only the fragmented, terrified accounts of a neighbor who peered through a frosted window for a single, soul-shattering moment. He described the family not as people, but as figures in a divine orrery. They stood in the center of the main room, not speaking, not touching, but connected by faint, shimmering lines of light that arced between them. Their bodies, once human, had become expressions of a terrible, perfect geometry. Asterisk. Clara, the neighbor said, was at the center. Her body was held in a pose of impossible symmetry, her small limbs forming a perfect, multi-pointed star. The glow from her eyes had spread, suffusing her skin with a soft, internal light. Thomas and Elias stood on either side, their bodies bent into complex, interlocking angles, their movements synchronized with a precision that defied biology. Abigail, he said, was the most changed. She stood slightly behind them, her head tilted back, her arms outstretched. No longer a woman, but a living conduit. Her body a gateway through which the geometric force was pouring into the world. Asterisk, this is the climax of the horror, not in a monster, but in this complete, silent, and elegant annihilation of human form and spirit. They were not possessed. They had been solved, like a mathematical equation. Their spiritual and psychological essence had been overwritten by a new, alien consciousness, defined by pure, cold, and irreversible geometry. The thrilling, seductive aspect of the earlier transformations, the grace, the precision was now revealed in its final, terrifying form. It was the beauty of a crystal forming, of a star collapsing, an act of creation that is also an act of total destruction. It must now confront the truth I have been slowly realizing. As I read these accounts, I felt the structure of my own investigation begin to buckle. The lines I had drawn between medical case, religious event, and paranormal encounter dissolved. They were all inadequate labels for what happened in Willowfen. This was an event that existed outside our categories, a glimpse into a reality governed by laws we cannot comprehend. My own mind felt the strain, the intellectual vertigo of staring into an abyss of absolute order, as the geometric pattern on the snow reached its full extent, connecting the Harlan house, the mill, and the church in a single, vast diagram. The thrumming in the earth intensified. The townspeople, huddled in their homes, felt their own bodies begin to resonate with it. Teeth chattered in rhythmic patterns. The small bones of the inner ear vibrated in sympathy. They were no longer just witnesses. They were becoming part of the instrument. The final act of the night was not loud. It was a moment of profound, terrifying silence. The pulsing light from the Harlan house coalesced into a single, brilliant point. The thrumming stopped. The pressure vanished. And for a moment, the town of Willowfen was held in a pocket of absolute, preternatural stillness. And then, it was over. The light was gone. The pattern in the snow remained, etched into the landscape like a scar. And the Harlan family was no longer there. Dawn on December 25th, 1879, did not bring relief to Willowfen. It brought clarity, and clarity was worse. The geometric pattern in the snow was the first thing the townspeople saw, a vast, impossibly intricate diagram that linked the key points of their small world. It was a statement, a signature left by the architect of the night's events. A small group of men, led by Reverend Hale, approached the Harlan house. The door was unlocked. The inside was cold, silent, and perfectly ordered. There were no signs of a struggle, no overturned furniture, no violence. There was only an unnerving precision. The chairs were arranged in a perfect circle. The plates in the kitchen were stacked in a spiral. The wooden cross, which had hung tilted for months, now lay on the floor, broken into 3 pieces of exactly equal length, laid out to form a perfect equilateral triangle. Of the Harlan family, there was no trace. They had not fled. Their winter coats still hung on their pegs. Their boots were by the door. They had simply ceased to be present in the form the world understood. They had been, for lack of a better term, geometrically abstracted from reality. This is where the story of Willowfen becomes a ghost in the archives. The town, in a collective act of psychological self-preservation, began the process of forgetting. Reverend Hale's final entry in the parish ledger is a masterpiece of terrified understatement. December 25th. The Harlan family, removed by an act of divine will or a geometric proposition. The ledger is now closed on this matter. He documented them as deceased, cause unknown, and the town accepted it. To admit the truth would have been to admit that the world was not as they knew it, that their faith was a shelter with walls made of paper, and that their bodies were merely provisional arrangements of matter, subject to revision. The unresolved mystery is the most haunting aspect of this case. No bodies were ever found. The house stood empty for years, an object of fear and morbid curiosity, until it was quietly dismantled by the town council. Its timbers used to repair a bridge, its foundation stones scattered. The mill fell into disuse, its great wheels slowly consumed by the river's rust and reeds. My own journey becomes part of the story here. In my research, I found that the official town records make no mention of the Harlan's disappearance. They simply cease to exist in the census of 1880. It is an act of communal erasure, but the echoes remain if you know where to look. In the county land registry, the Harlan property is listed as unclaimed, title voided by unaccountable event. In the margins of Dr. Whitaker's private papers, I found a sketchy of frantic, desperate drawing of a human eye with a crystalline, geometric lattice inside it. Beneath it, a single scrawled question. Is this the next shape of man? The theme of irreversible transformation is absolute. The family did not die. They became something else. And the implication is that this potential, this geometric imperative, may not have been an isolated event. It may be a latent property of our reality. Over the years, the story of Willowfen faded into a local folktale, a ghost story told to frighten children. Stripped of its terrifying, plausible details, the glowing eyes became swamp gas. The geometric patterns became frost formations. The family became victims of a winter plague, but the core of the story, the element of dread, persisted. I found one last thread, a letter written in 1902 by a woman who had been a child in Willowfen in 1879. She wrote to her sister, recalling the night, ***, do you remember the lights, Sarah? The way the snow sang. Father said it was an electrical storm, but we knew. We felt it in our bones. I sometimes still feel it on cold nights, a kind of alignment, as if my own body remembers the pattern. I look at my children, and I see the way they move, the way their eyes catch the light, and I wonder, did it ever truly leave us? This is the haunting, unresolved note on which the Willowfen case rests. The mystery was never solved because it was never a crime. It was a transformation, and the possibility that this transformative force was not a one-time event, but a dormant potential within the very fabric of our world, is the most unsettling conclusion of all. As I stand back from the scattered documents, the faded photographs, the hushed and fearful testimonies, I am left with a profound sense of intellectual and emotional disturbance. I set out to investigate a forgotten historical case. I found instead a story that acts as a mirror, reflecting our deepest anxieties about the stability of our world, our bodies, and our minds. Could this really have happened? The rational mind seeks to dismiss it, to classify it as mass hysteria, a fully A+ years, fueled by isolation and religious fervor. 2.2 environmental toxins in the water, inducing neurological hallucinations, and perhaps that is all it was. But the records the doctor's precise, terrified notes on impossible biology, the ministers grappling with a faith that buckled under the weight of geometric perfection, the physical evidence of the patterns in the snow, witnessed by an entire town, they suggest something more, something eerily plausible. The final question is not for the archives to answer. It is for you. Have you ever felt it? On a quiet night, a sense of pressure, of an order just beyond your perception? Have you ever seen a pattern in nature so perfect it felt intelligent? The story of Willowfen suggests that these are not idle fancies. They are echoes of a language we have forgotten how to speak, a language of pure, cold, and beautiful geometry. Would you have sought a scientific cause or a spiritual one? Would you have stayed or would you have fled? And when the light began to shine from within, would you have chosen to look away? Or would you have surrendered to the terrifying, thrilling beauty of becoming something new? What really happened in Willowfen that night is that a place remembered itself aloud, and we, who were mostly busy with our own rooms, were made, briefly, to hear. Whether it would have been better not to, I cannot say. The ledger in me is still open to the page where the sums come odd, in pencil, not ink, with a small smudge where numbers married without permission and refused to be put asunder.